The moment HOA Karen realized she could no longer control me, she lost her mind right in front of a locked steel gate she could not open, and the cameras mounted above that gate captured every second of her meltdown, while the quiet countryside behind me stayed perfectly calm. She came tearing down the gravel road like a storm that had finally found something it could not destroy, her white SUV fishtailing slightly as she slammed the brakes inches from the bars. Dust rolled past her tires, while she jumped out of the vehicle already shouting my name, as if yelling loud enough might magically turn 40 acres of private land back into something she could rule. I stood on the other side of the gate, watching her through the metal bars while the wind moved slowly across the tall grass behind me. And for the first time since I had met her, the person who loved control more than oxygen looked completely powerless. The steel gate between us stood 8 feet tall, welded solid into concrete posts, and locked by a keypad she did not have the code for, and it represented the exact moment her authority stopped. She grabbed the bars and shook them like a prison inmate trying to break free, screaming about HOA jurisdiction, community standards, and illegal obstruction, and if those words still carried the same power they once had. The cameras mounted on the posts recorded her red face, the rage in her eyes, and the absolute disbelief that someone in the neighborhood had finally built a wall she could not climb over. For nearly a decade, Karen had ruled Willowbrook Estates like a suburban dictator, wearing a polite smile, and every resident inside that neighborhood knew exactly how quickly her tablet could turn small annoyances into expensive violation notices. People had learned to keep their heads down because fighting her always seemed to end the same way, with more fines, more letters, and more threats, until most homeowners simply paid whatever she demanded to make the pressure stop. But standing there in front of my gate, shouting into land she had no power over, Karen was finally facing the one thing she had never prepared for. Eileen continued yelling that I had no right to block the road, and that the HOA would fine me in bankruptcy if I did not remove the gate immediately. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted, because the road she was screaming about ended exactly where the subdivision boundary stopped, and the 40 acres behind the gate were not part of her kingdom. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Karen noticed the cameras a few seconds later, and the moment she realized her meltdown was being recorded, her voice jumped another level, echoing across the open fields like a siren refused to stop screaming. She pointed at the cameras and demanded that I turn them off while claiming I had no legal right to film her, which would have been funny if she had not spent years installing surveillance signs around the HOA claiming cameras were necessary to protect the community from rule breakers. The contrast between the quiet farmland behind me and the fury exploding in front of the gate could not have been sharper, because nature did not care about HOA bylaws, and neither did the land she was trying to control. Karen slammed her palm against the keypad panel and punched random numbers into it like a gambler trying to crack a vault. But the lock beeped once and stayed sealed exactly the way it had been designed to. Her voice cracked slightly when she realized the code system would not open for her, and the first hint of panic slipped through the anger that had always defined her authority. For years she had walked through Willowbrook Estates like someone who owned every driveway and lawn in the neighborhood, but now she was standing at the edge of something she could not regulate, threaten, or fine into submission. The cameras captured her pacing back and forth across the gravel road while she shouted that the HOA board would destroy me if I did not remove the gate, which was the moment I calmly reminded her that the board had absolutely no jurisdiction outside the subdivision bound. The words hit her harder than any insult could have, because they exposed the truth she had spent years pretending did not exist. Her empire ended at the property line, and my land began exactly where her power stopped. That realization cracked something inside her control, because suddenly the threats she had used against neighbors for years sounded hollow even to her own ears. She tried to recover by demanding access for inspection purposes, claiming the HOA needed to verify that my property improvements complied with community standards. But the desperation in her voice made it obvious she was inventing reasons to keep authority she had already lost. I watched quietly while she argued with a gate that did not answer back, and the calm in that moment felt like standing on the far side of a storm that had finally exhausted validated itself. Karen's hands shook slightly as she gripped the bars again, staring past me at the field stretching into the distance, as if she still expected the land to obey her out of habit. The reality was simpler than anything she could accept, because the 40 acres behind that gate were never part of Willowbrook Estates, and no rule she had ever written could change that fact. Her entire identity had been built on the belief that she could control every detail of the neighborhood, and the gate in front of her proved the world did not end where her authority stopped. I could see the exact moment that truth started to sink in, because her shouting slowed into something colder and more calculated. She stepped back from the gate and told me this was not over, promising that lawyers, inspectors, and city officials would soon prove that the gate violated some regulation she had not thought of yet. The threat sounded rehearsed, like something she had repeated to frightened neighbors for years, but the difference now was that the land behind me existed in a legal space she could not reach. I told her calmly that she was free to try whatever she wanted, and the confidence in my voice seemed to irritate her more than any insult could have. The gate stayed closed while the wind moved gently through the fields behind me, and the quiet countryside around us made her anger feel even louder. For the first time since I had moved into Willowbrook Estates, Karen looked like someone who had just discovered the limits of her power. She finally stormed back to her SUV after another minute of shouting that accomplished nothing, slamming the door hard enough to echo across the road before accelerating away in a spray of gravel and dust. The cameras kept recording until the road was empty again, capturing the moment when the loudest authority in the neighborhood had been reduced to yelling at a locked gate. That video would later become the moment everyone in Willowbrook realized something fundamental had changed. But at that point, the story of how Karen reached that breaking point was only beginning to unfold. 6 months earlier, I had been just another homeowner inside her HOA, quietly trying to rebuild my life after a divorce that had already burned enough bridges. Back then, I had no idea that the quiet suburban neighborhood I moved into had a ruler who treated every rule book like a weapon. Karen had spent years turning Willowbrook Estates into a place where people whispered complaints about her power instead of challenging it directly, and most residents had accepted the situation because fighting her always made things worse. I was not planning to become the person who exposed the limits of her control, but the moment she started treating my property like something she owned, the conflict became unavoidable. The gate she was screaming at did not appear overnight, and neither did the 40 acres behind it. Both existed because Karen had spent years pushing people until eventually someone decided to push back. The meltdown she delivered on camera that morning was not the beginning of the story, but it was the first time the entire neighborhood saw her authority break in public. And the deeper truth was that the gate was not just a barrier between her and my land. It was the line where her reign ended. 6 months before HOA Karen was screaming at my steel gate like it had personally betrayed her, I was just another guy trying to start over in what looked like a perfectly ordinary suburban neighborhood. My name is Marcus Remy. I'm 45 years old, and the version of me that first drove into Willowbrook Estates believed quiet streets and neat lawns meant peace. After a brutal divorce that ripped through my life like a tornado through a trailer park, peace was the only thing I wanted. My ex-wife had walked out with our financial advisor, which meant the two people I trusted most managed to betray me in a single spectacular act of disloyalty. By the time the paperwork settled, I didn't want drama, revenge, or confrontation. I wanted quiet. I wanted distance. I wanted a place where I could close the door at night and not hear echoes of everything that had gone wrong. Willowbrook Estates looked like that place. The houses were clean and identical in the way developers like to sell comfort, with tidy lawns, evenly spaced maple trees, and sidewalks that curved through the neighborhood like someone had drawn them with a ruler. When I bought my 3-bedroom ranch house on the corner lot, I thought I had finally found the reset button my life needed. What I didn't know was that the real power structure in Willowbrook had nothing to do with houses, mortgages, or landscaping. It revolved around one person who had spent nearly a decade turning HOA authority into something closer to personal rule. Her name was Dolores Peaton, but no one called her that. Around the neighborhood she was known simply as Karen, and the nickname wasn't whispered with affection. Karen had been the president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association for 8 straight years. 8 years is long enough for a person to forget the difference between leadership and ownership, and somewhere along that stretch, Karen stopped seeing the HOA as a group of neighbors managing shared responsibilities. She started seeing it as a throne. Karen drove a white luxury SUV that was always spotless, as if the vehicle itself represented the standards she believed everyone else should follow. The license plate read HOA1, which would have seemed like a joke if the woman behind the wheel didn't take it so seriously. She carried a tablet everywhere she went, and the device contained what residents quietly called the rule book of doom. Inside that tablet were photographs of alleged violations, notes about homeowners, and a list of fines that could turn small inconveniences into expensive lessons about obedience. The first time I met Karen was 3 weeks after moving into my new house. I was standing in my driveway early one Saturday morning drinking coffee and enjoying the quiet when someone knocked on my front door with the kind of aggressive rhythm that signals bad news. When I opened the door, Karen was standing there in sunglasses with her tablet already open, looking like a police officer about to read me my rights. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't welcome me to the neighborhood. The first words out of her mouth were a violation notice. She pointed her stylus toward the black mailbox mounted beside my driveway and announced that it did not comply with community color standards. According to Karen, Willowbrook mailboxes were required to be forest green. Black was unauthorized. The violation carried a $150 fine and a mandatory replacement order. I stood there staring at her for a moment because the mailbox had been installed by the previous homeowner years earlier and had apparently passed every inspection since. When I explained that the mailbox came with the property and had been approved before I even moved in, Karen tapped something on her tablet and told me approval records were irrelevant if the board decided standards had evolved. The message was clear. Her authority existed in the present, and anything that contradicted it was simply outdated information. I replaced the mailbox because at that point I believed the conflict was just a misunderstanding. New homeowner meets strict HOA president. Small adjustment gets made. Everyone moves on. What I didn't realize was that Karen's authority didn't operate like a one-time correction. It functioned more like a pressure system that constantly searched for new ways to prove it existed. Within the next month, more violation notices appeared. My work van parked in my own driveway triggered a penalty for commercial vehicle presence. The small security cameras I installed after hearing about a burglary down the street became an aesthetic disturbance because Karen claimed they created an atmosphere of suspicion. Even the little garden gnome my daughter gave me during one of her visits earned a warning about decorative objects that failed to meet neighborhood design standards. Each notice arrived with the same tone, bureaucratic certainty, and every fine carried the same underlying message. Karen was watching. What fascinated me most about the system was how normal it seemed to everyone else. When I talked to neighbors about the violations, most of them simply shrugged and said it was easier to comply than to fight. A retired couple down the street told me they had paid nearly $2,000 in fines over the years for things like lawn edging angles and fence paint shades. Another neighbor explained that Karen once fined him because his garbage bin had been visible from the street for more than 20 minutes on collection day. No one seemed shocked by these stories. They spoke about Karen the way people talk about bad weather. Unpleasant, but unavoidable. The deeper I looked into the HOA structure, the clearer the power dynamic became. Karen controlled the board meetings because most residents stopped attending years ago. The same 3 or 4 supporters filled the remaining seats, and every vote passed without serious debate. The bylaws technically required hearings for violations, but Karen often issued fines first and scheduled hearings later, which meant homeowners were already on the defensive by the time they tried to challenge her decisions. Over time, this pattern created something more psychological than legal. People simply stopped questioning her authority because doing so required energy most homeowners didn't want to spend. They had jobs, families, mortgages, and responsibilities that made prolonged battles with an HOA president feel exhausting. Karen understood that dynamic perfectly. She never needed to shout or threaten openly because the system itself did the intimidating for her. But the moment that truly showed me how far her authority had spread came during the small barbecue I hosted to meet a few neighbors. It was a simple gathering on a Saturday afternoon with burgers on the grill and a handful of people chatting on the patio. Kids were laughing in the backyard, and for the first time since the divorce, I felt something close to normal again. Then Karen walked through the side gate without knocking. She carried a handheld noise meter and a measuring tape like someone conducting a scientific experiment. Without greeting anyone, she began measuring the sound level of the music playing from a small speaker on the table. She announced that the gathering exceeded acceptable noise parameters and warned that if the group did not disperse within 30 minutes, she would report the event as a disturbance. Watching neighbors quietly collect their plates and and leave felt like witnessing the invisible weight Karen's authority had placed on the entire community. No one argued with her. No one challenged the absurdity of a daytime barbecue being treated like a public nuisance. They simply left because experience had taught them resistance only made things worse. That evening, I stood alone on the patio staring at half-eaten burgers and realized something fundamental about Willowbrook Estates. Karen's power didn't exist because the rules were strong. It existed because everyone had learned to live around her authority instead of confronting it. And once I saw that pattern clearly, the idea of living under it forever became impossible to ignore. The gate Karen would later scream at was not even a concept in my mind yet, but the seeds of that rebellion were already planted the moment she chased my neighbors out of my own backyard. I didn't know exactly how I would challenge her system, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The next time Karen tried to control something that belonged to me, the conversation was going to be very different. The deeper I lived inside Willowbrook Estates, the clearer it became that Karen's power wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about controlling the psychological environment of the neighborhood itself. Most HOAs are supposed to function like a shared agreement between homeowners, a system designed to protect property values while maintaining reasonable standards. Willowbrook had started that way years earlier, but somewhere during Karen's long reign, the balance shifted. Instead of a community governed by rules, it became a territory governed by Karen. She didn't just apply the bylaws, she interpreted them, expanded them, and quietly twisted them until they served one purpose above all else, reinforcing the idea that she was the final authority on everything that happened inside the neighborhood boundaries. The process didn't happen overnight. Power structures like that grow slowly, the way weeds grow through cracks in concrete, until eventually the entire surface changes. Karen began by enforcing rules aggressively when she first became HOA president. At the time, residents actually supported her because the neighborhood had been struggling with a few neglected properties and some homeowners who ignored basic maintenance. Karen positioned herself as the person willing to restore order. She talked about protecting property values, preserving the aesthetic beauty of Willowbrook, and making sure the neighborhood stayed attractive for future buyers. In the beginning, those promises sounded reasonable. People attended meetings, they voted on proposals. The HOA board operated like a group rather than a throne. But Karen discovered something during those early years that changed the entire dynamic. Most people didn't want to deal with HOA politics. They had jobs, kids, responsibilities, and lives that made sitting through long neighborhood meetings feel like a chore. Slowly, attendance dropped. One by one, the homeowners who once questioned Karen's ideas stopped showing up, leaving only a small handful of loyal supporters in the room whenever decisions were made. That vacuum gave Karen the opportunity she needed to reshape the HOA into something far more centralized. The bylaws technically required votes and hearings, but when only 4 or 5 people attended meetings, it didn't take much effort to control the outcome. Karen began introducing small amendments that gave the board more discretion over violations. She adjusted enforcement procedures so fines could be issued before hearings rather than after them. She encouraged the board to approve broader definitions of community standards, which meant almost anything could eventually be classified as a violation if Karen decided it disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic. Each change looked minor when viewed individually. Each one passed quietly because hardly anyone was present to challenge it. But together, they built a system where Karen's interpretation of the rules mattered more than the rules themselves. Residents slowly began noticing the shift, but by then the structure had already hardened. A violation notice from Karen didn't just mean correcting a problem. It meant navigating a bureaucratic process she completely understood, while most homeowners barely knew how to respond. Appeals required attending hearings during weekday evenings, when many residents were still commuting home from work. Documentation needed to be submitted through a website Karen controlled. Fines accumulated daily until hearings were scheduled, which meant even winning an appeal could leave homeowners paying hundreds of dollars simply because the process moved slowly. The imbalance created a quiet intimidation factor that spread through the neighborhood. People started talking about Karen the way tenants talk about strict landlords, rather than the way neighbors talk about an elected representative. You could see it in the way homeowners reacted when her SUV turned Lawnmowers suddenly started running if grass looked slightly too tall. Trash bins disappeared behind fences faster than magicians performing sleight of hand. Parents told their kids to bring bicycles into the garage immediately if Karen drove by. It wasn't that Karen physically forced compliance. It was that everyone had learned exactly how uncomfortable life became when she focused her attention on a particular house. The abuse didn't always look dramatic on the surface. It often appeared in small, repeated actions that slowly drained people's patience. One elderly couple received weekly notices about the angle of their driveway edging because Karen claimed it disrupted the uniform line of neighboring lawns. A young family down the street received 3 separate warnings because their children's basketball hoop was visible from the road. Another homeowner was fined after Karen photographed his work truck parked overnight in his own driveway and classified it as a commercial vehicle violation. None of those incidents alone looked outrageous enough to spark a rebellion, but when dozens of neighbors experienced similar pressure over time, the cumulative effect became clear. Karen had created a system where every homeowner felt like they were one minor mistake away from becoming her next enforcement project. The most revealing moment came during my second HOA meeting. I decided to attend after receiving several fines in my first 2 months because I wanted to understand how decisions were actually made. The meeting took place in the small community clubhouse near the entrance to Willowbrook Estates. The room held maybe 30 chairs, but only 7 people were present when I walked in. Karen sat at the front table with her tablet open, flanked by board members who nodded along as she reviewed the agenda. The rest of the room contained homeowners who looked tired rather than angry. That detail mattered because it showed exactly how Karen's authority functioned. She didn't face crowds of furious residents demanding accountability. She faced small groups of people who were already worn down by the process of challenging. During the meeting, Karen reviewed violation reports with the calm precision of someone reading a grocery list. She displayed photographs on a projector showing slightly uneven hedges, faded fence paint, and one mailbox that leaned a few degrees off-center. Each image came with a fine amount already calculated. When one homeowner tried to explain that his mailbox had been damaged by a delivery truck, Karen cut him off politely and suggested he submit evidence through the HOA portal for review. The portal, I later learned, could take weeks to process requests, while fines continued to accumulate. Watching the interaction made something painfully obvious. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was managing time in a way that favored her authority. The longer homeowners had to wait for answers, the more expensive resistance became. That system worked because people eventually decided paying the fine was easier than continuing the fight. The abuse also extended into subtle social pressure. Karen had built a network of loyal supporters who reinforced her reputation whenever someone complained. They appeared in neighborhood forums defending her decisions and reminding everyone that HOA rules existed to protect property values. They attended meetings regularly and applauded when Karen announced new enforcement initiatives. Their presence created the illusion that Karen's authority represented the will of the community rather than the momentum of a system most people had stopped challenging. Over time, this structure created something almost invisible but incredibly powerful. Karen's authority became normal. Residents expected her to appear with violation notices. They anticipated the possibility of fines the way drivers expect traffic tickets if they speed. The idea of confronting the entire system started feeling unrealistic, especially when most homeowners believed they were fighting alone. I understood that dynamic clearly the night I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the stack of violation letters Karen had already sent me. Each one described a small issue with language that sounded official and absolute. But when I read them carefully, I noticed something important. The rules themselves were less precise than Karen's enforcement style suggested. Many violations depended entirely on her interpretation of what qualified as a disturbance or aesthetic problem. That discovery planted the first serious doubt in my mind about the structure she had built. If the rules were flexible, then Karen's power depended entirely on people believing they couldn't challenge her interpretations. The problem for Karen was that once someone starts questioning the foundation of authority, the entire structure begins to look different. And that realization was exactly what pushed me to start looking beyond the neighborhood itself. Because if Karen's power only existed inside Willowbrook Estates, then the obvious question became simple. What would happen if I stepped outside it and entirely. The idea that finally cracked Karen's authority didn't begin as a revenge plan. It started as curiosity. After that HOA meeting where I watched Karen treat neighbors like defendants in a courtroom she controlled, something about the entire structure of Willowbrook Estates stopped feeling permanent. Power systems always look invincible from the inside because people assume the boundaries around them are solid. But the more I studied Karen's enforcement tactics, the more I realized her authority relied on one simple condition. Everything had to remain inside the neighborhood. Every rule she enforced, every fine she issued, every hearing she conducted existed because the HOA boundary gave her a legal arena where those powers made sense. The moment something stepped outside that arena, the structure that made her powerful stopped working. That realization sat quietly in the back of my mind for weeks while life in Willowbrook continued the way it always had. Karen still drove through the streets like a patrol officer inspecting territory. Neighbors still straightened trash bins and trimmed hedges when they saw her SUV approaching. Violation notices still appeared in mailboxes with the same polite but threatening tone. On the surface, nothing had changed. But once I started questioning the limits of her authority, I couldn't stop noticing how often those limits depended on geography. One evening, I opened my laptop and started looking at county property maps out of simple curiosity. Willowbrook Estates looked neat and symmetrical from above. Rows of identical houses arranged around curving streets like pieces on a board game. But the map also showed something interesting beyond the eastern boundary of the subdivision. Behind the final row of houses, there was a wide stretch of land marked as agricultural zoning. It wasn't part of the HOA. It wasn't part of the subdivision at all. It was 40 acres of open farmland owned by a man named Ezra Whitfield. I had seen the name before on local diner receipts and a few town newsletters because Ezra's family farmed that land for generations. The more I studied the map, the clearer the possibility became. If someone owned that property, they would sit directly beside Willowbrook Estates without belonging to it. No HOA rule, no board hearings, no violation notices, just land that existed outside Karen's entire system. That discovery felt like noticing a door in a room where everyone else had been staring at the walls. I drove past the farmland the next morning on my way into town. The difference between Willowbrook and Ezra's land was impossible to ignore. Inside the subdivision, everything looked manicured and carefully controlled. Lawns trimmed into identical shapes and houses painted in coordinated palettes. But the farmland stretched wide open, grass bending naturally in the wind, while an old wooden fence traced the edges of the property. It felt quiet in a way Willowbrook never quite managed to be, because there were no bylaws telling the land how to look. I didn't plan anything immediately. Instead, I started asking small questions around town about Ezra Whitfield. The answers came easily because Ezra was one of those people who had been part of the community long enough that everyone knew his story. His family had owned the farmland since the 1950s. He was getting older now, and rumors had circulated for months that developers were trying to buy the property to expand the subdivision. Those developers saw the land the same way Karen saw the neighborhood, as something that could be shaped into uniform houses and new HOA streets. Ezra, however, had apparently refused every offer. According to the waitress at Murphy's Diner, he hated the idea of turning his family's fields into another block of identical homes. The story made the next step feel almost natural. One Thursday morning, I walked into Murphy's Diner and saw Ezra sitting in a corner booth with a slice of pie and a newspaper. He looked exactly like the kind of man who had spent decades working outdoors, his hands weathered and his posture relaxed in a way that suggested patience rather than urgency. I introduced myself and asked if he minded company. Ezra studied me for a moment before folding his newspaper and nodding toward the empty seat across from him. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. I told him about Willowbrook Estates and how I had moved there recently. He told me about the farmland and how his family had planted crops there long before the subdivision existed. Eventually, I mentioned the developers who had been trying to buy his land. Ezra laughed softly and said they kept offering more money each year, but none of them understood the one condition he cared about. He didn't want his family's property turned into another neighborhood controlled by an HOA. That was the moment the entire idea became real. I asked him if he would consider selling the land to someone who intended to keep it agricultural rather than turning it into a development project. Ezra looked at me with quiet curiosity, as if measuring whether the question was serious or just conversation. When I explained that I was interested in the property myself, the old farmer leaned back in his seat and smiled for the first time. The negotiations didn't take long because Ezra wasn't trying to squeeze the highest possible possible price from the land. He wanted a buyer who respected what the property represented. The number we agreed on felt almost surreal, considering how much land 40 acres actually contained. It was expensive for me personally, but it was still far less than what developers had offered, because Ezra valued preservation more than profit. Within a few weeks, the paperwork moved through the county office, and the deed transferred into my name. The moment I held that document, Karen's entire power structure began to look fragile. Owning the farmland meant I now controlled property that existed beside Willowbrook without belonging to it. And the very first improvement I decided to make was the one that would eventually drive Karen into the meltdown the cameras captured. The access road leading to the farm ran along the eastern edge of the subdivision before opening into the fields. Technically, the road sat entirely on the agricultural property line, but Karen had grown accustomed to using it as if it belonged to the neighborhood. Residents occasionally walked dogs there. HOA inspectors sometimes used the road to check fence lines along the boundary. No one had ever challenged that casual access because the farmland had always remained open, but the moment the land changed owners, that assumption stopped making sense. I hired a surveyor to confirm the exact property boundaries. When the measurements came back, they confirmed what I had suspected from the maps. The road belonged to the farmland. It wasn't part of Willowbrook Estates at all. That meant I had the legal right to control access to it. A week later, I called a contractor and described the gate I wanted installed at the entrance to the road. I asked for something strong enough to make the boundary unmistakable. Steel posts anchored in concrete, 8 feet of welded bars, a keypad lock system, and security cameras mounted high enough to capture the entire entrance. When the contractor finished the installation, the farmland felt like a completely different world. The gate stood quietly at the edge of Willowbrook Estates, like a line drawn across the landscape. On one side of the bars sat the subdivision Karen controlled. On the other side stretched 40 acres of land she couldn't regulate, inspect, or fine. It took exactly 2 days for Karen to discover what had changed. And when she finally drove down that road and saw the gate blocking her path, the reaction that followed proved just how much of her authority depended on everyone believing she could control everything around her. Karen's first reaction to the gate was fury, but fury alone doesn't collapse a power structure. What destroys authority is exposure. And the moment Karen realized she could not quietly pressure me into removing the barrier, she switched strategies from intimidation to spectacle. Within 48 hours, the entire neighborhood knew about the gate because Karen made sure they did. She started by knocking on doors along the eastern side of Willowbrook Estates, telling residents that a dangerous obstruction had appeared at the boundary road. According to her version of events, the gate threatened property values, blocked emergency access, and represented a hostile act against the community. What she didn't mention during those conversations was that the road she claimed to protect had never belonged to the HOA in the first place. Karen understood something fundamental about public perception. If people hear the accusation before the facts, many of them accept the story without questioning. For years, she had used that dynamic to reinforce her authority, and she expected the same tactic to work again. But the gate changed the environment of the conflict because it introduced something Karen had never faced before: evidence. The cameras mounted above the keypad recorded every visit she made to the entrance, every angry demand, every attempt to intimidate me into unlocking it. At first, those recordings were simply a precaution in case she tried damaging the property, but the footage quickly became something else entirely. The more Karen returned to the gate to shout about HOA jurisdiction, the more obvious the situation looked to anyone watching the clips. A woman who claimed to control the neighborhood was arguing with a piece of land she had no legal authority over. The first major escalation came when Karen attempted to involve the city. She filed a complaint claiming the gate blocked an access road used for public safety vehicles. Within a week, a city inspector arrived to investigate the claim. Karen stood beside him while he examined the entrance, pointing at the steel bars and explaining how the obstruction violated community standards. The inspector listened patiently before asking one simple question that shifted the entire conversation. He asked Karen whether the road belonged to the subdivision or the farm. Karen hesitated just long enough for the answer to become obvious. When the inspector checked the property records and confirmed the road sat entirely on agricultural land, the complaint dissolved instantly. The city had no authority to force me to remove a gate from my own property. Karen's expression during that moment carried a mix of disbelief and anger that felt almost theatrical. She had spent years using government language to intimidate homeowners, and suddenly those same procedures were telling her she had no jurisdiction at all. That moment would have been enough to embarrass most people, backing away quietly. Karen was not most people. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. The next tactic involved social pressure. Karen began posting messages in the Willowbrook community forum describing the gate as a threat to neighborhood harmony. She claimed the farmland project would attract noise, traffic, and unpredictable activity that could disrupt the carefully maintained character of the subdivision. Her supporters repeated the argument, warning neighbors that allowing someone to challenge HOA authority would set a dangerous precedent. But something unexpected happened as those conversations spread. Instead of uniting the neighborhood against me, Karen's campaign started reopening old frustrations residents had quietly stored for years. Homeowners who had paid fines for minor violations began remembering how unfair those penalties felt. The retired couple with the driveway edging problem mentioned how Karen had fined them repeatedly despite their attempts to comply. Parents who had removed basketball hoops and swing sets because of HOA warnings began questioning whether those rules had ever been reasonable in the first place. The gate didn't just block Karen from entering the farmland. It symbolized the first successful resistance anyone had mounted against her authority. That symbolism created a ripple effect through Willowbrook Estates. Neighbors started walking to the boundary road just to see the gate for themselves. Some stood quietly on the HOA side of the bars, watching the field stretch beyond the fence. Others asked questions about the farmland project and whether the rumors Karen had spread were actually true. I answered those questions calmly whenever people approached, explaining that the land would remain agricultural and that the gate existed simply to establish the correct property boundary. The more residents saw the reality of the situation, the more Karen's warnings started sounding exaggerated. And then came the moment that transformed the entire conflict from neighborhood drama into public humiliation. One afternoon, a delivery truck carrying farm equipment arrived at the entrance to the road. I opened the gate using the keypad code and allowed the driver through. Karen happened to drive by at exactly that moment. The instant she saw the gate opening, she accelerated down the road and followed the truck through the entrance before it could close again. The problem for Karen was that the gate operated on an automatic timer. Once the truck cleared the sensors, the steel bars slid shut behind her vehicle with a heavy mechanical clang. Suddenly, Karen's SUV sat inside 40 acres of private farmland, while the locked gate stood between her and the subdivision she claimed to control. The cameras captured the entire scene as she stepped out of the vehicle and realized what had happened. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the keypad in disbelief. Then the shouting began. Karen demanded that I open the gate immediately, accusing me of trapping her illegally on my property. The irony was impossible to ignore. She had spent years forcing residents to navigate bureaucratic procedures whenever they challenged her authority, and now she was the one standing inside a situation she could not control. I walked toward the entrance slowly, while the cameras recorded everything. When Karen demanded that I release her immediately, I reminded her that she had entered private property without permission. I also pointed out that the keypad code existed specifically to prevent unauthorized access. Karen paced across the gravel while her anger grew louder. She accused me of harassment, threatened lawsuits, and insisted the HOA board would remove the gate by force. But none of those threats mattered because the legal reality remained simple. She was standing inside land that belonged to someone else. Eventually, I opened the gate and allowed her to leave, but the footage of that encounter had already spread far beyond Willowbrook Estates. One of the neighbors who had been watching the scene from the HOA side of the road shared the video in a local community group online. Within hours, the clip began circulating across town. People who had never heard of Willowbrook suddenly saw the HOA president screaming inside farmland she had entered without permission. The contrast between Karen's authority inside the subdivision and her helplessness outside it turned the video into a perfect example of how quickly power can unravel once its boundaries become visible. The effect inside Willowbrook was immediate. Residents who had once avoided challenging Karen started talking openly about the gate incident. Conversations that used to happen quietly in driveways began happening in the middle of the street. Homeowners who had paid fines for years began asking whether those penalties had ever been legitimate. Karen tried to respond by scheduling an emergency HOA meeting to address the situation. She framed the meeting as an opportunity to restore order, but by the time neighbors gathered in the community clubhouse, the atmosphere had already changed. People weren't attending out of obligation anymore. They were attending because they wanted answers. And when Karen stepped to the front of the room to explain why the gate represented a threat to the neighborhood, the crowd watching her no longer looked intimidated. They looked curious. Curious people ask questions. And the more questions Karen faced that evening, the more obvious it became that her authority had begun to crack. The moment Karen realized intimidation no longer worked, she tried something far more dangerous. She tried escalation. When a power structure begins collapsing, the person at the center often reacts the same way a cornered animal does. They lash out harder, louder, and faster, because retreat would mean admitting the power was never real to begin with. Karen had spent almost a decade building the image that she controlled Willowbrook Estates with absolute authority. Losing that illusion in front of neighbors wasn't something she could quietly accept. So instead of stepping back after the gate incident, she pushed the conflict further than anyone expected. The first sign came 2 days after the video of her getting trapped inside the farmland started circulating around town. I received a thick envelope in the mail stamped with the official logo of the HOA. Inside was a formal notice claiming the association had begun legal action against me for hostile property obstruction and interference with community oversight. The language sounded dramatic, but the accusation itself made very little sense. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my farmland. They could not enforce rules on land outside the subdivision boundary. But Karen wasn't sending the letter to win a legal argument. She was sending it to maintain fear. That tactic had worked for years inside Willowbrook. Homeowners received intimidating letters filled with official language and assumed the HOA had legal power behind every word. Karen expected the same reaction. She expected me to panic, remove the gate, and apologize before the situation became more expensive. Instead, I took the letter to someone who understood exactly how HOA authority worked. Her name was Sarah Blackwood. Sarah was a property rights attorney who had built a reputation around the county for dismantling abusive homeowner associations. Unlike most lawyers who simply processed paperwork, Sarah specialized in something more strategic. She studied how HOA boards misused their authority and then used the law itself to expose those patterns. When I walked into her office with Karen's letter, Sarah read it once and started smiling before she reached the end of the page. She explained that Karen's biggest mistake wasn't installing fines or sending threats. Her mistake was believing the HOA could control people who stepped outside its boundaries. According to Sarah, homeowner associations are extremely powerful inside the communities they govern, but that power has strict legal limits. Once a property sits outside the subdivision, the HOA has no enforcement authority at all. Karen's letter wasn't just incorrect, it was reckless. The more Sarah examined the documents I brought with me, the more interested she became in Karen's behavior inside Willowbrook Estates. She asked questions about how violations were issued, whether hearings were conducted properly, and how fines were calculated. I answered as honestly as possible, describing the pattern residents had quietly endured for years: the aggressive enforcement, the questionable hearing procedures, the way fines often appeared before homeowners even had the opportunity to respond. Sarah leaned back in her chair after listening to the entire story and explained something that shifted the conflict into a completely new direction. She said Karen's authority might look strong on the surface, but if the HOA had been abusing its enforcement powers, the entire system could be challenged in court. That possibility changed everything. Instead of defending against Karen's accusations, Sarah suggested we start investigating the HOA itself. The first step involved gathering evidence. Over the next few weeks, several residents from Willowbrook quietly contacted Sarah's office after hearing about the gate incident and the legal threats Karen had sent. People who had spent years paying fines without question suddenly realized there might be a way to challenge the system that produced those penalties. They brought letters, violation notices, photographs, and payment records showing how Karen had enforced HOA rules. Some of the stories sounded eerily similar to my own experience. Mailboxes fined for minor color variations, work vehicles penalized despite vague wording in the bylaws, decorations classified as disturbances based entirely on Karen's personal interpretation of neighborhood aesthetics. The more documents Sarah reviewed, the clearer the pattern became. Karen had not just just been strict with the rules. She had been expanding them in ways that the HOA bylaws never explicitly allowed. In several cases, fines had been issued before hearings occurred. In others, the penalties had exceeded the maximum amounts listed in the association's own documents. Those irregularities alone could have been enough to challenge the enforcement system. But the investigation uncovered something even more explosive. When Sarah requested the HOA's financial reports, she discovered irregular accounting entries connected to violation fees. Over the past several years, the association had collected tens of thousands of dollars in penalties from homeowners. On paper, that money was supposed to support neighborhood maintenance projects like road repairs, landscape, and clubhouse improvements, but the records didn't clearly show where much of the money had actually gone. Some payments appeared to have been routed through small maintenance contracts that lacked proper documentation. Others were listed under vague descriptions that didn't match any completed projects. Sarah's interest in the case shifted from curiosity to determination the moment she noticed those inconsistencies. HOA boards manage community funds, which means misusing that money can carry serious legal consequences. Suddenly, Karen's attempts to intimidate residents with violation fines looked less like enforcement and more like a system that deserved closer scrutiny. Word of the investigation spread quietly through Willowbrook. Residents who once feared Karen began sharing their experiences openly with Sarah's team. The retired couple with the driveway edging violations provided receipts showing they had paid nearly $2,000 in fines over several years. The family forced to remove their basketball hoop produced letters documenting repeated warnings, despite the bylaws never explicitly banning such equipment. Each story added another piece to a puzzle that revealed how Karen's authority had operated for nearly a decade. Meanwhile, Karen continued behaving as if the gate conflict was still the main issue. She filed additional complaints with the city and attempted to pressure the HOA board into supporting her legal threat. But the environment inside Willowbrook had already begun changing. Residents who once stayed silent were now asking questions about the investigation. Some homeowners stopped paying violation fines altogether until the legal situation became clearer. Karen's authority depended on compliance, and the moment that compliance began disappearing, the structure she controlled started shaking. The confrontation had grown far beyond a disagreement over a steel gate. What began as a boundary dispute was now evolving into a full examination of how Karen had used her power inside the neighborhood. And the most dangerous part for Karen was that she no longer controlled the narrative. Lawyers, documents, and evidence were beginning to speak louder than her authority ever had. The gate outside Willowbrook Estates had shown residents that Karen's control ended at a property line. Now the investigation threatened to show that even inside that line, her power might never have been as legitimate as she claimed. The night Karen's authority finally collapsed did not begin with shouting. It began with silence. The Willowbrook Community Clubhouse was more crowded than anyone had seen it in years, and that alone told the story before a single word was spoken. For nearly a decade, HOA meetings had been quiet affairs, attended by the same small circle of loyal supporters who rarely questioned anything Karen proposed. But this meeting looked different. Every chair was filled, neighbors lined the walls, and several people stood near the doorway because there was no room left inside. The atmosphere carried something unfamiliar for Willowbrook Estates. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. Residents had heard about the investigation Sarah Blackwood was conducting. They had watched the video of Karen trapped inside the farmland gate spread across local forums. They had listened to conversations about fines, hearings, and financial records that suddenly didn't look as clean as Karen always claimed. For the first time since Karen became HOA president, the community had gathered not to listen, but to evaluate. Karen entered the room with the same posture she had used for years, tablet in hand and shoulders squared, like someone who still believed authority could be restored through confidence alone. But the reaction she received when she stepped to the front table was colder than anything she had faced before. No applause, no polite nods from the usual supporters. Just a room full of homeowners watching quietly, as if waiting for something inevitable to happen. Karen opened the meeting by repeating the same accusation she had been pushing for weeks. She claimed the gate outside Willowbrook represented a threat to the community and insisted the HOA had taken legal steps to resolve the issue. The speech sounded familiar because residents had heard versions of it before, whenever Karen needed to redirect attention away from criticism. But this time, the explanation failed to carry the authority it once had. Several people in the crowd raised their hands almost immediately, asking questions Karen did not expect. One homeowner asked why the HOA was attempting to regulate land outside the subdivision boundary. Another asked whether the association had spent community funds pursuing legal threats that had no jurisdiction. A third resident stood up and asked something even more direct. He asked Karen whether the HOA financial records Sarah had requested actually matched the projects those funds were supposed to support. Karen attempted to answer the questions with the same controlled tone she always used, but the room could feel the difference. Each response sounded less confident than the one before it. Each explanation triggered another question. The meeting had turned into something Karen had never allowed before, a real conversation. Eventually, the tension reached a point where Karen tried to regain control by declaring the discussion closed. She said the board would address the financial concerns internally and reminded everyone that HOA authority required cooperation from residents. That was the moment Sarah Blackwood stood up from the back row and walked calmly towards the front of the room. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Even people who had never met Sarah recognized the significance of her presence because Karen's expression shifted the instant she saw the attorney approaching the table. Sarah introduced herself to the room with the quiet confidence of someone who already understood exactly how the evening would end. She explained that her office had spent the past several weeks reviewing documents provided by Willowbrook residents, along with the HOA's own financial reports. The investigation had uncovered multiple enforcement violations and irregularities in how fines were issued and recorded, but the most serious findings involved the association's handling of community funds. Sarah described how several maintenance contracts listed in the HOA records did not match actual work completed in the neighborhood. Landscaping invoices referenced projects residents had never seen. Repair expenses appeared in months when no repairs were scheduled. The money collected through violation fines had been documented as supporting community improvements that never occurred. As Sarah spoke, the quiet tension in the room turned into something heavier. People began looking at each other, realizing that the pattern many of them had suspected might finally be confirmed. Karen attempted to interrupt the explanation several times, claiming the documents had been misinterpreted, but Sarah calmly placed copies of the financial reports on the table in front of the board members and explained that the evidence would soon be submitted for formal legal review. The room stayed silent as Karen stared at the papers. For years, she had controlled every discussion inside that clubhouse. She had directed the meetings, set the agenda, and decided which complaints deserved attention. Now the situation had reversed. The evidence was speaking louder than her authority. One by one, residents began asking questions again, but this time the tone had changed. They weren't asking Karen for clarification anymore. They were asking why they had trusted the system for so long. The retired couple with the driveway edging fines stood up and explained how much money they had paid in penalties over the years. The family forced to remove their children's basketball hoop described how the warnings made them feel like outsiders in their own neighborhood. Each story reinforced the same realization spreading through the room. Karen's authority had not just been strict, it had been unchallenged. And once people began challenging it together, the entire structure collapsed faster than anyone expected. Karen eventually stopped trying to defend herself. The tablet she carried everywhere remained on the table in front of her, but she no longer touched it. Without the system of compliance she had relied on for years, the device looked less like a symbol of power and more like a record of everything that had gone wrong. The meeting ended with the board announcing that Karen would step down from her position while the investigation continued. No dramatic confrontation followed. No shouting match closed the evening. Karen simply gathered her tablet, stood up, and walked out of the clubhouse while the room watched quietly. The silence that followed her departure felt heavier than applause ever could have. In the months that followed, Willowbrook Estates changed in ways that seemed impossible only weeks earlier. The HOA board reorganized under new leadership and introduced oversight procedures to prevent enforcement abuse. Several fines issued under Karen's authority were reviewed and reversed. Residents who once avoided meetings began attending again, not out of obligation, but because the neighborhood finally felt like a place where their voices mattered. As for the farmland outside the subdivision, it became something completely different from the threat Karen described. The open fields remained quiet, and the gate that once triggered so much anger simply stood where it had always been. The cameras still recorded the entrance road, but the only vehicles passing through now belonged to visitors curious about the small agricultural project growing beyond the fence. Occasionally, neighbors from Willowbrook walked to the boundary road, looked through the bars toward the fields. The gate didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a reminder that authority built on intimidation connection eventually meets a boundary it cannot cross. Karen left Willowbrook Estates, not with a dramatic farewell, but with the quiet absence of someone whose power ended the moment people stopped believing. The gate stayed exactly where it was, silent and unmoving at the edge of the subdivision, and every time the wind moved through the fields behind it, the message remained the same. Karen's reign ended at that line.